The judge laughed at the defendant, not knowing he was facing an 18-year-old legal genius. Judge Ricardo Valdez thought that day would be like any other. Another courtroom, another defendant, another sentence. But what he couldn't imagine was that he was about to face something that would test everything he thought he knew about justice. Before him, in the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the atmosphere was tense, with a disturbing murmur floating in the air. The public filled every corner of the gallery, curiously watching the young man standing next to the defense table. He was a thin young man with his hands buried in his pockets and his chin barely raised, showing a mixture of calm and insolence that was unsettling. His name was Julian Herrera. He was 18 years old and faced charges of vehicle theft and resisting arrest, serious accusations enough to ruin his life. But Judge Valdez didn't see a criminal in front of him, but a reckless teenager who thought he was smarter than the system. He leaned back carelessly, drumming his fingers on the bench with impatience. "You think you know about laws?" he asked with a sarcastic half-smile. "This isn't a debate competition, kid." Some laughter escaped through the room. The bailiff, court clerk, and even the prosecutor seemed to enjoy the judge's condescending tone. But Julian didn't flinch, didn't smile, said nothing because he had been preparing for this moment for years. Not because he expected to be accused of something, but because his world always revolved around the judicial system. While other young people played video games or dreamed of being athletes, he read law books and analyzed imaginary trials. His mother, Teresa Herrera, worked as a legal assistant for more than 20 years. At home, conversations always revolved around negligent prosecutors, biased judges, and overloaded defenders. Julian absorbed every word. At 14, he already debated with arguments that left adults silent, but none of that mattered. Now, for Judge Valdez, he was just another Latino kid in trouble. "Let's finish this quickly," he muttered while browsing the file. "I have dinner tonight." The room laughed again, but this time Julian barely raised an eyebrow and let a slight smile appear. Valdez had just made his first mistake, and no one else seemed to have noticed it. The case prosecutor, Natalia Fuentes, stood up like someone who already knows the outcome. She walked with firm steps toward the podium, adjusting her dark suit jacket with precision. She didn't need to prove anything, at least not to her colleagues. Her voice resonated with measured confidence, like someone who had repeated that speech dozens of times. "Your Honor, the state will demonstrate, beyond reasonable doubt, that defendant Julian Herrera was caught in possession of a stolen vehicle, a BMW X3 2022 model, reported as stolen just hours before the arrest." She paused, looking at the jury with an almost theatrical air. The defendant was pursued by officers in the city center and actively resisted arrest. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence is clear. It speaks for itself. The public murmured, shifting in their seats. Apparently, everything sounded convincing. Stolen car, attempted escape, physical evidence. Judge Valdez nodded briefly, as if the case was already resolved. "Continue, prosecutor," he said without much interest. Natalia approached the jury with calculated steps, holding a bundle of documents. "The defense will try to convince you that Mr. Herrera was a victim of confusion, that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time." She then turned to Julian for the first time. "But let's be honest, what kind of innocent person runs from the police?" The tension in the room increased, as if someone had los symbols, whirred the temperature. The judge leaned forward, resting his head on his hand. Julian remained motionless, impassive. The prosecutor calmly returned to her papers. "We have here the sworn statement of Officer Marcos Diaz. He claims to have personally seen the defendant driving the vehicle before he tried to escape. The arrest procedure was carried out according to established protocol." The judge nodded again. "Sounds pretty simple," he murmured, and for almost everyone in that room it was, but not for Julian. He had dedicated his entire life to studying legal cases and quickly noticed the gaps, the inconsistencies. It just wasn't time to speak yet, not yet. Valdez gently tapped the bench with the gavel. "Now let's hear the defense." Julian's assigned public defender, a woman named Laura Rios, stood up with obvious nervousness. "Your Honor, my client." But she didn't finish the sentence. Julian placed a hand on her arm in silence. It wasn't an aggressive interruption. It was a decision. Laura looked at him for a few seconds and then nodded with resignation, sitting back down. The young man finally spoke. I will represent myself, Your Honor. Absolute silence took over the court. Judge Valdez looked at him with a mixture of astonishment and mockery. You alone? He asked with a hint of irony, but Julian's voice didn't waver. Yes, Your Honor. I will conduct my own defense. And at that instant, something in the room changed forever. What was about to come was no longer just any trial. It was the beginning of an unexpected battle, and Julian was more than ready to fight it. Julian moved forward calmly. His firm steps echoed on the wooden floor, and his upright posture conveyed a confidence that no one expected. The gazes were fixed on him, those of the jury, the public, even Judge Valdez, who now watched him with a raised eyebrow. Julian let the silence settle, uncomfortable, heavy. It was intentional. When he finally spoke, he did so with a clear, measured voice. Before beginning, Your Honor, I would like to confirm a detail with the prosecution. Prosecutor Natalia crossed her arms, tilting her head with a skeptical smile. Go ahead. Julian took another step. You mentioned that Officer Marcos Diaz saw me behind the wheel of the vehicle before I tried to flee. Is that correct? Correct, she replied with impatience, like someone who wants to end an unnecessary scene, and that testimony is included in his official report. Of course, she replied without hesitation. Julian nodded and then directed his gaze to the judge. Then, Your Honor, I request that testimony be withdrawn as valid evidence. A murmur ran through the gallery. The judge frowned. On what grounds? For the first time, Julian took his hands out of his pockets and pointed toward the prosecution table. Because Officer Diaz didn't see me in that vehicle. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. Natalia's face tensed for a second. What are you talking about? She asked with a voice suddenly less firm. I would like to request the GPS records of Officer Diaz's patrol car for that night, Julian continued. If he claims to have seen me, his location should match the place where the detention occurred, but I have reason to believe it won't. The silence became thicker. The judge slowly turned toward the prosecutor. Any objections? She swallowed. The pause was long enough for everyone to notice the doubt. No, Your Honor, she finally said, although her tone no longer had the same confidence. Julian breathed deeply. He knew this was only the first blow, one that had already shaken the foundations of the prosecution. For the first time, laughter had disappeared from the atmosphere. Natalia leafed through her papers seeking to reorganize her strategy. While the GPS record is being verified, the facts remain the same. The defendant's fingerprints were on the steering wheel of the stolen car. Julian nodded, wetting. Without interrupting, walked slowly toward the jury. That's true, but I'd like you to reflect on the following. He stopped, making eye contact with each one. The prosecution wants you to believe that fingerprints prove a crime. But let's think. Have you ever tried on a garment in a store? Maybe you put your hands in the pockets, looked at yourself in the mirror, left it, and left. Pause. Hours later, someone steals that garment. Does that mean you were the thieves? A murmur ran through the jury rows. The logic was simple, but powerful. That car was parked outside a convenience store for hours. I was there with 3 friends. We passed by it. I touched it, leaned on it, opened the door out of curiosity, but I didn't steal it, didn't drive it. It was foolish, stupid, but not a crime. He let the room digest his words and then launched the next precision strike. Does touching something make you a criminal? The prosecution was beginning to lose control of the narrative, but Julian was just getting started. Prosecutor Natalia Fuentes tried to regain control of the room. She coughed, looked at her notes, and resumed her argument, but her speech no longer had the same firmness. Regardless of how those fingerprints got on the steering wheel, they remained key evidence of his presence in the stolen vehicle. Julian interrupted her without raising his voice. That brings us to another important question. Your Honor. He turned to Judge Valdez, who now watched him with growing attention. Is the forensic expert who processed the fingerprint evidence present to testify? Valdez blinked, surprised. He looked at the prosecutor. Natalia hesitated for an instant. No, he wasn't summoned, she admitted. Julian made a slight bow of his head, as if confirming a suspicion. So, if I understand correctly, the state wants to use key evidence to incriminate me, but has decided not to bring the specialist responsible for processing it. I don't have the possibility to interrogate him, to verify the chain of custody, or to question the accuracy of the analysis. He turned to the jury. Does that seem like justice to you? The room fell into silence. Even the public's murmurs had died down. Natalia pressed her lips tightly. Each word from the young man pierced like a scalpel through the narrative the prosecution had built. Judge Valdez sighed deeply, pressing his fingers against the bridge of his nose. He realized at that moment that this case wouldn't be the routine he had anticipated, but Julian hadn't finished yet. He took another step toward the podium, and his voice acquired a more serious, almost solemn tone. Your Honor, I would like to present additional evidence. Valdez frowned. What evidence? A sworn statement from the vehicle's real owner, Mr. Mauricio Campos. The judge raised an eyebrow. And why isn't that in the prosecution's documents? Julian held a sheet with both hands. I ask myself the same question. He turned to Natalia. Do you remember what Mr. Campos declared the night of the alleged theft? The prosecutor avoided his gaze. She knew what was coming. Julian read aloud. I left the car running while I went into the store. When I came out, it was gone. I saw the kid who took it. He was white. The reaction was immediate. A murmur of astonishment ran through the room like a wave. Julian raised the sheet. This is in the original police report. The prosecution omitted it. The officer who arrested me never mentioned it. And yet, here we are with a defendant who doesn't even match the thief's description. Natalia tried to intervene. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was found in possession of the vehicle. Julian shook his head. No, I wasn't. His voice still didn't rise, but his firmness was unshakable. I was detained several blocks from where the vehicle was abandoned. I was walking with my friends, returning home after buying some sodas. I wasn't running, wasn't driving. I didn't even know the car had been stolen. He turned to the jury once more. The only thing that links me to this case is a system that decided to rush and a series of assumptions no one bothered to verify. Judge Valdez let out a long sigh, leaned back, passed his hands over his face as if he needed to wake up from lethargy. The case that had begun as routine was crumbling before his eyes, and what disturbed him most wasn't young Julian Herrera's ability, but the possibility that he was right. Julian looked at the jury again with serenity. The real suspect escaped that night. The police didn't catch him, so they found a young Latino in the same area and decided that was enough. That's what this trial is about. Not evidence, but prejudice. Silence, dense, total. The judge cleared his throat. Prosecution, do you wish to present anything else? Natalia Fuentes remained rigid. Her hands gripped the papers as if trying to squeeze out an exit that didn't exist. Finally, she shook her head. No, Your Honor. At that moment, Julian turned and slowly approached his table. He stopped, breathed deeply, and said something that would seal the trial's fate. I've been called insolent. I've been told I'm not a lawyer. Maybe they're right. But if someone who's 18 years old, without a degree, without experience, manages to dismantle a case that should have been clear for the state, then the problem isn't me, it's the system. A mixture of astonishment and discomfort took over the tribunal. The jury exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, who until then had smiled smugly, seemed bewildered. Judge Valdez looked at Julian for a long moment, then lowered his eyes to the file. He browsed it in silence, as if suddenly he no longer trusted every word written in it. He closed the folder, adjusted his glasses, and said in a clear voice, "Case dismissed." The word fell like a bomb. A second of absolute astonishment preceded the explosion of murmurs in the room. Some Biki Sarwats brought their hands to their mouths. Others began to applaud silently. Julian didn't react. He remained standing, motionless, letting the weight of that moment settle in every corner of the room. He knew this wasn't just a personal victory, it was a turning point. Judge Valdez, with the gavel still in his hand, gave him one last look. In it, there was no mockery or arrogance, only something resembling respect, perhaps even remorse. Julian returned the look for a few seconds, then turned around and walked toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, a voice stopped him. "Mr. Herrera." Julian stopped without turning around. The judge was slow to speak, but when he did, his words were clear. You should consider studying law. A small smile appeared on Julian's lips. He didn't need to consider anything. He had already decided. Outside, the courthouse was a swarm of cameras, microphones, and flashes. Reporters crowded on the stairs, firing questions point blank. Julian, did you know the judge was going to dismiss the case? What are you going to do now? How does it feel to have beaten a prosecutor with years of experience? Julian pulled up his hoodie and lowered his head. He didn't want fame, wasn't seeking headlines. For him, this was never about ego, but about justice. And there, in the middle of all that media chaos, a familiar figure was waiting for him. His mother, Teresa, stood at the foot of the stairs, arms crossed and an expression that mixed pride with exhaustion. When Julian reached her, she shook her head and let out a sigh. Son, you almost killed me with fright. He scratched his neck, sketching a shy laugh. I had to try. Teresa looked at him for a long second and then hugged him tightly. You were always the most stubborn in this family. The flashes continued, but Julian no longer heard them. On the other side of the street, leaning against his vehicle, with his hands in his pockets, Judge Ricardo Valdez was also watching. He no longer had the haughty posture with which he had entered the courtroom that morning. The arrogance in his eyes had dissipated, replaced by an expression much harder to define. Introspection. He hadn't foreseen that routine trial, another day, another defendant, another automatic verdict, would end that way, because what Julian Herrera had done wasn't common. He had not only defended his innocence with solid arguments, he had made the judicial system look at itself. And for once, the system stepped back. The judge knew it. That would mark him for a long time. How many other cases were resolved with the same haste, with the same omissions? How many people had been convicted without clear evidence, simply for having the wrong face, the wrong accent, the wrong story? Julian hadn't just saved his name. He had exposed a deep flaw, an open wound that no one wanted to see. The most disturbing thing of all was thinking about how many Julians hadn't had the knowledge or opportunity to defend themselves. The press continued outside, but the young man was no longer paying attention. For him, that was just the end of a chapter. A difficult one, an unjust one, but not the last, because something inside him had affirmed itself with fierce clarity. That wouldn't be the last courtroom where he would be, but next time he wouldn't be in the defendant's dock. He would be on the other side as a lawyer, as a defender, as a voice for those who don't have one. And when that day came, he wouldn't be alone. He would be with every person who was ever silenced. Julian knew he couldn't change an entire system in one afternoon, but he could begin something, an echo, a spark, an idea, because justice is written with laws, yes, but it's sustained by people, and people can change, can open their eyes, can listen, but only if someone has the courage to speak first. So if this story touched you, even for a moment, share it, because what Julian experienced could be happening right now to someone you know. And maybe that person doesn't have the voice, or the knowledge, or the opportunity, but you can help make their story heard. Like this video, subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that matter, and above all, don't stop questioning what seems normal, because what's common isn't always just. And next time someone sits before a judge, maybe it won't be Julian, maybe it'll be your brother, your son, your friend, or you.